In the dark spring of 1944, while the English coast prepared for the largest invasion in human history, General George S. Patton was commanding an army that did not exist. It had headquarters, signal traffic, supply dumps, armored camps, landing plans, and a reputation so terrifying that German intelligence treated it like a loaded gun pointed straight at France. But if a Luftwaffe pilot had flown low enough over parts of southeastern England, he might have seen the truth shimmering beneath the illusion: rubber tanks, fake landing craft, dummy installations, and the outline of war built from canvas, wood, wire, and fear. At the center of that phantom force stood Patton, the one American commander Adolf Hitler believed would lead the real blow. And that was exactly why Patton could not go where he wanted most to be. On June 6th, when thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the Channel into Normandy and walked into machine gun fire, Patton stayed behind. Not because he lacked courage, not because he was forgotten, not because the Allies had no use for him. He was kept away because he was too dangerous to waste, too controversial to trust, and too valuable to be seen where the Germans least expected him. The greatest deception of the war required one thing above all: George Patton had to remain alive, visible, and absent. To understand why the fiercest American general of the war was not allowed onto the most famous battlefield of the war, you have to begin with a humiliation, a scandal, and a reputation so powerful it became a weapon all by itself. By the time Europe waited for invasion in 1944, Patton had already become something larger than a mere field commander. He was not simply another Allied general with stars on his shoulders and maps spread across a table. He was a symbol. To his admirers, he embodied aggression in its purest military form: speed, shock, profanity, motion, steel, and certainty. To his critics, he was brilliant but volatile, exactly the kind of man who could win a battle in the morning and ignite a political disaster by nightfall. Both judgments were true enough to make him useful and dangerous at the same time. George S. Patton had spent most of his adult life preparing for a kind of war that finally arrived in the 20th century with engines and radios. He believed in movement with a near-religious intensity. He distrusted hesitation. He despised stagnation. If warfare in the First World War had frozen armies into mud and trenches, Patton lived for the opposite vision: engines roaring across open ground, armored columns refusing to stop, terrified enemies never allowed to recover their balance. He did not merely think offensively. He thought with offense. It governed his instincts, his language, his theories, even his posture. That made him intoxicating in victory. It also made him difficult inside an alliance that depended on restraint, diplomacy, and trust among men with competing egos, national interests, and political masters. The Allied High Command was not a simple ladder of obedience. It was a fragile structure held together by personality and compromise. Dwight Eisenhower had to manage Americans and British, soldiers and politicians, planners and field commanders, ambition and caution. A spectacularly gifted subordinate could be a blessing. The wrong subordinate at the wrong moment could shake the whole machine. Patton's rise through North Africa and Sicily had convinced both enemies and allies that he was among the Allies' most formidable battlefield commanders. In North Africa, the U.S. Army had suffered the sting of humiliation at Kasserine Pass. American formations were green, badly coordinated, and bloodied by a better organized enemy. Patton arrived like an electrical storm. He imposed discipline, sharpened standards, punished sloppiness, and changed the tone of command almost overnight. Men who resented his severity still felt the force of it. Units that had seemed uncertain began to look like soldiers. He radiated the message that American arms were not in Africa to learn politely. They were there to hit back. Then came Sicily, and Sicily transformed Patton's image from a hard driver into something almost legendary. The island campaign was always bigger than the map itself. It was a test of Allied cooperation, British-American rivalry, Mediterranean strategy, and personal ambition. Bernard Montgomery, the famed British field marshal, dominated much of the planning. Patton's 7th Army initially played a supporting role on the left, while Montgomery's 8th Army drove toward the primary objectives. Patton did not enjoy supporting roles. He never had. When the campaign began to shift, Patton pushed hard, first westward to secure the island, then eastward in a rapid advance that became a race in all but name. The dash to Messina, conducted through difficult terrain, under enemy pressure, and amid tangled command politics, gave Patton something priceless: a myth. He appeared to many observers as the general who did not wait for permission to create momentum. He arrived in Messina before Montgomery and ensured the cameras were there to see it. To German observers, he looked reckless, fast, unpredictable, and offensively minded in a way that conventional Allied commanders often did not. To Hitler and the German High Command, that mattered. But Sicily also produced the crisis that nearly ruined him. In August 1943, during the fighting on the island, Patton visited military hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering from what was then poorly understood battle exhaustion, often contemptuously dismissed as cowardice. In two separate incidents, Patton struck soldiers who were physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. One of them was Private Charles Kuhl, the other was Private Paul Bennett. Patton cursed them, accused them of weakness, and slapped them. The incidents were not mere bursts of temper hidden in a foxhole. They were witnessed, reported, and carried the full moral weight of a commander abusing the broken men under his care. For a time, the matter was contained inside military channels. Eisenhower was furious. He understood instantly that Patton's behavior had crossed a line that could not simply be laughed away as rough language from a fighting general. Yet Eisenhower also knew Patton's value. That tension defined everything that followed. He reprimanded Patton sharply and forced him to apologize, not only to the soldiers but to medical staff and commanders. It was humiliating, and it was meant to be. Eisenhower wanted the lesson burned in, but he stopped short of destroying him. That decision was not simple mercy. It was strategy under pressure. The Allies were at war with Germany, not engaged in a moral seminar on leadership. Eisenhower knew Patton was gifted. George Marshall knew it too. Many senior officers believed that if Patton could be controlled, his aggressive instinct would be indispensable in the campaign still ahead. Yet indispensable men are often the hardest men to place. You do not just ask whether they are useful, you ask whether they are usable. When the slapping incidents became public in late 1943, the danger multiplied. Patton was no longer merely a difficult general with a private reprimand. He was a public embarrassment, attached to a coalition preparing for its most politically sensitive operation. The outrage in the United States was real. So was the concern in London. D-Day would not just be a battle. It would be an international event watched by governments, newspapers, parliaments, and grieving families. If something went wrong in Normandy, every controversial decision made beforehand would be dragged into the light. Every appointment would be judged, every scandal would return, and there, standing in the center of that storm, was George Patton. To understand why Patton was not allowed at D-Day, you have to separate desire from permission. Patton absolutely wanted combat command in the invasion of France. He burned for it. Nothing in his personality suggests he would have accepted a secondary role with ease, but wanting Normandy and being given Normandy were very different matters. After Sicily, his path to commanding the opening phase of the invasion had narrowed almost to nothing. Eisenhower needed absolute steadiness in the chain of command for Overlord. He needed commanders the British trusted, commanders Washington could defend politically, commanders who would follow the plan while still adapting under catastrophic pressure. The Normandy landings were not a stage for independent theatrics. They were a machine of terrifying complexity, involving naval fire, airborne drops, weather windows, tidal calculations, logistics on a scale never before attempted, inter-allied coordination, and the management of immense uncertainty. If the beaches failed, the entire liberation of Western Europe might be delayed or broken. There was no appetite for risk in the personality chosen to handle the opening. That did not mean Patton lacked military competence for the mission. It meant his judgment was in question in a broader sense. He might have been brilliant in maneuver warfare, but Normandy's first hours demanded more than ferocity. They demanded a commander whose presence reassured every nervous political and military partner in the alliance. Patton did not reassure people. He electrified them, inspired them, scared them, angered them, and forced them to react. That quality, in 1944, was both his power and his prison. There was another factor, less public but no less decisive. Patton's reputation had become useful to the enemy precisely because the enemy feared him. German intelligence did not assess Allied generals as interchangeable. The Germans studied personalities. They monitored movements, signals, command assignments, press coverage, and diplomatic whispers. They knew Eisenhower was the supreme commander, but Eisenhower was not the kind of field commander they expected to spearhead an assault. When German analysts asked themselves which American general most fit the image of an all-out offensive aimed at decisive breakthrough, one name rose above the rest: Patton. That perception had been earned partly in Sicily. German officers had watched his conduct there and concluded that Patton was exactly the sort of commander who would be trusted with the main effort of an invasion. He looked dangerous because he was dangerous. In a war increasingly driven by intelligence and deception, that enemy belief was a strategic asset. And once a belief of that magnitude exists in an enemy headquarters, a clever opponent does not waste it. He feeds it. This was where the humiliation of Sicily, the politics of overlord, and the mechanics of deception fused into one of the strangest command roles of the war. The Allies had long understood that invading France meant not only crossing the Channel, but controlling German expectations. Normandy could not simply be attacked. It had to be disguised. The Germans had to be forced to think about other possibilities, especially the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France and therefore the most obvious location for a massive Allied landing. Calais was closer, logistically attractive, heavily significant in German thinking, and exactly the place many German commanders expected a rational enemy to strike. The Germans fortified it accordingly. The Allied deception plan, broadly known as Operation Bodyguard, included several elements designed to protect the true landing site by creating false threats elsewhere. One of the most famous branches of this effort was Operation Fortitude South, which aimed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would come not in Normandy, but in the Pas de Calais region. For that lie to work, the Allies needed more than fake maps. They needed a believable army. Not a paper army mentioned in rumor, but a formation with enough apparent mass, enough command identity, enough noise and routine and posture to seem real. And for that army to seem real, it needed a commander the Germans would believe in. That commander was Patton. Thus emerged the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, one of the most successful military illusions ever created. FUSAG was not entirely empty on paper. There were headquarters structures, staff work, communications, and all the visible signs of preparation that could be fed to German intelligence. Yet it was fundamentally a phantom. In southeastern England, dummy landing craft crowded rivers and shorelines, inflatable tanks appeared in camp areas, wooden aircraft and fake depots suggested concentrations of force. Controlled radio traffic painted the rhythm of a vast army assembling for a decisive assault. Double agents, most famously the network feeding German intelligence through channels the Allies secretly controlled, passed along carefully tailored fragments that reinforced the same story. Everything pointed in one direction. The real blow was still coming, and when it came, Patton would lead it. Imagine the personal cruelty of that assignment for Patton. He was a warrior built for impact, and now his reputation was being asked to fight in his place, while other men prepared to storm the beaches. He was too notorious to trust with the landing, too famous to discard, and too feared by the enemy to send anywhere that would expose the truth. The Allies did not bury him because he was finished. They displayed him because he was useful. That distinction must have felt almost unbearable. There is a temptation to see Patton's role in the deception as honorary, a theatrical holding pattern for a disgraced general waiting to be restored. That misunderstands the stakes. FUSAG mattered because the Germans believed it mattered. Patton's presence was not decorative. It was structural. Remove him, and the illusion weakens. Let him appear too near Normandy too soon, and the illusion may collapse. Give him a visible operational role in the actual June landings, and German analysts might suddenly conclude that Normandy was indeed the main event. By simply being where the Germans expected him to be, Patton made the lie stronger. That is why not allowed at D-Day was not just punishment, it was operational necessity. By early 1944, the Allies were constructing not only an invasion force, but a narrative for enemy consumption. In war, narratives kill. German planners were already divided by conflicting instincts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending the coast, both understood that the next Allied move would be massive, but they differed on how to meet it. Rommel feared Allied air power would crush any mobile reserve trying to move after the landings. He wanted strength close to the beaches. Others believed armored reserves should be held back for a concentrated counterstroke. Over all of them towered Hitler, whose control over key reserves and refusal to decentralize decision-making could paralyze the defense at critical moments. In that atmosphere, conviction mattered more than certainty. If Hitler could be made to believe Normandy was a diversion and Calais the true target, he might hold back forces fatally needed in Normandy. If 15th Army, guarding the Pas de Calais, remained fixed in place waiting for Patton's Phantom Army, then real men fighting in Normandy would face fewer reinforcements. That was the essence of the gamble. The fake army had to become more threatening than the real one, at least inside the enemy's mind. Patton understood reputation perhaps better than any general of his generation. He cultivated spectacle as part of command. His ivory-handled pistols, polished helmet, severe standards, theatrical language, and relentless self-dramatization were not accidental eccentricities. They formed a battlefield persona intended to inspire his troops and intimidate everyone else. He wanted to look like war. In the strange logic of fortitude, all of that flamboyance suddenly became useful at a distance. A subdued, invisible Patton would not have served the deception nearly as well. The Germans needed to imagine him exactly as they feared him, restless, primed, dangerous, and preparing to strike. So the Allies let him be seen. Carefully. Public appearances, inspections, visible travel, command associations, all were managed within the broader deception effort. German reconnaissance and intelligence collection needed fragments. Not too much truth, not too little. Just enough detail to make the false picture cohere. Patton's very existence in southeastern England, near the notional invasion axis toward Calais, carried meaning. If the Allies were planning a real main invasion through the narrowest crossing, who better to lead the breakthrough than George Patton? The idea practically sold itself to German assumptions, and that was the trap. The more the Germans respected Patton, the more useful it became to keep him away from Normandy. Behind the scenes, Patton was not idle in the sense of being forgotten. He was waiting for the moment when the deception would have done its work, and the Allies could finally unleash him in a real field command. The command intended for him was the Third Army, which would become one of the most aggressive and mobile American armies in the European War. But Third Army's great dash across France belonged to a later chapter. In the weeks before D-Day, the clock had not yet granted him release. Until the Germans were committed to the wrong picture, Patton had to remain the ghost. This created one of the deepest ironies of the entire war. On June 6, 1944, the day most associated with courage under fire, one of the Allies' bravest and most attack-minded generals contributed to victory by not fighting. His absence from the beaches was part of the attack. His immobility was a weapon. His frustration was an asset. When the invasion finally came, it came against Normandy, not Calais. The landings stretched across beaches with names that would become immortal: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Airborne troops dropped inland amid darkness, confusion, drowned fields, and gunfire. Naval guns opened. Infantry waded through surf. Engineers cut gaps in obstacles. Entire plans dissolved on contact with reality and had to be rebuilt minute by frightened, determined men no one could fully control. The bloodletting at Omaha alone was enough to break weaker organizations. Patton was not there, but his shadow was. On the German side, the opening response to D-Day was marked by delay, confusion, and argument. Weather had helped deceive them. So had their assumptions. Some senior German leaders were absent or sleeping when the invasion began, partly because the weather was thought unfavorable for a major assault. Rommel himself was away from the front. Panzer reserves were not immediately released with the speed required to smash the beaches before the Allies built strength ashore. Yet beyond the immediate confusion lay the deeper success of Allied deception. Even after the Normandy landings, many German leaders believed this might still be a preliminary operation, a diversion meant to draw forces west, while the decisive thrust would later come at Calais. And who did they imagine leading that decisive thrust? Patton. That is the crucial point often lost in simplified retellings. Patton was not merely absent from D-Day because the Germans expected him elsewhere before June 6th. He had to remain absent after June 6 as well, at least long enough to sustain the illusion that Fusag still threatened the Pas de Calais. If Patton had suddenly appeared in Normandy on the morning of the invasion, the deception would have suffered a catastrophic blow. German analysts could have argued, with real force, that the Allies had revealed their hand. The commander they had expected for the main assault had turned up in Normandy. Therefore, Normandy must be the main assault. Instead, Patton continued to serve as a ghost around whom German fear organized itself. The effect was enormous. German 15th Army, positioned in the Pas de Calais area, remained in place in substantial strength because the threat of a second, greater invasion persisted in Hitler's mind. Even as the fighting in Normandy intensified and the Allies struggled to expand the beachhead, the fear of Patton's supposedly larger strike across the narrower crossing helped pin down forces that might otherwise have been shifted more rapidly and decisively against the real lodgment. Every day of delay mattered. Every division held back from Normandy mattered. Every staff conference in which German commanders argued over whether the main blow was still to come mattered. That was the battlefield Patton inhabited in June 1944, not the hedgerows but the enemy imagination. The deeper tragedy, if one may call it that, lies in the fact that Patton's exclusion from D-Day was not caused by a single simple reason. People often want one dramatic answer. They want to hear that Eisenhower punished him, or that the slapping scandal ruined him, or that the Allies feared his recklessness, or that he was deliberately used as bait. All of those are true, but none alone is enough. The slapping incidents damaged him politically and morally. Without them, his chances of a major frontline role in the initial invasion might have been greater, though not guaranteed. The demands of coalition trust mattered enormously. Eisenhower needed reliability in a public and political sense, not just tactical aggression. Bradley, who ultimately commanded the U.S. First Army in Normandy, was seen as steadier and less combustible. Montgomery, despite his own difficult personality, held a commanding role in the land battle plan that already carried enough interpersonal tension without adding Patton into the opening mix. The architecture of Overlord required balance. Patton was not a balancing figure, he was an accelerant. Then, layered on top of that, came the logic of deception. Once Allied planners realized the Germans were primed to associate Patton with the main blow at Calais, his very non-participation became a necessity. If he had not already been politically difficult, he still might have been reserved for the deception. If he had been politically ruined but not feared by the Germans, he might simply have been sidelined. The strange historical power of the moment came from the collision of both truths. Patton was compromised enough to withhold, but valuable enough to weaponize. That collision may have tormented him more than open disgrace would have. A man like Patton could understand punishment. He could fight his way back from punishment. But to be told, in effect, that your greatest contribution to the liberation of Europe is that the enemy is terrified of you while you stand still, that required a different kind of endurance. It demanded obedience from a commander who adored action more than caution. Patton was not naturally obedient in spirit. He obeyed because he was still a soldier, because he still believed in victory, and because the chance of later command remained alive. But one should not romanticize his patience. He wanted blood and momentum, not camouflage. He did not dream of winning glory through inflatable armor and counterfeit signal traffic. Yet that was the role history handed him in the most sensitive weeks of 1944. There is also a more uncomfortable truth. Some Allied leaders may have believed Patton was better suited to exploitation than initiation. Normandy's opening phase was not, at first, the kind of war Patton liked best. The bocage country of Normandy, with its hedgerows, sunken lanes, confined visibility, and grinding attritional combat, could strangle operational elegance. The beachhead had to be secured, linked, supplied, and deepened before large-scale maneuver could blossom. In those first weeks, command required tenacity under constraint more than sweeping movement. Patton excelled when the front could be broken open and turned into a race. That opportunity would come later, spectacularly. But on D-Day itself and immediately after, the mission was survival and consolidation. This is not to say Patton could not have handled it. He was more adaptable than legend sometimes allows. But the nature of the opening battle made it easier for Allied commanders to imagine using him later, once the door had been forced ajar. If Normandy was the lock, Patton was the battering ram meant for the rooms beyond. Even Hitler's psychology played into this. Hitler had a habit of elevating certain enemy commanders into symbols and then reasoning from those symbols in distorted ways. He respected offensive audacity, even in enemies. Patton, with his aggressive image and rapid Sicilian advance, fit Hitler's conception of a decisive assault leader. So when intelligence suggested Patton was in southeastern England commanding a large formation opposite Calais, the story matched what Hitler wanted to believe. Normandy, by contrast, could be interpreted as a feint to draw German reaction away from the true objective. The deception worked not merely because the Allies supplied false information, but because that information slid neatly into pre-existing German expectations. That is why fake armies are never really fake in the ordinary sense. They are built from something real. In this case, the real substance was German belief about Patton. Consider what it means that rubber tanks and dummy camps were only half the deception. The other half was a human face. If the Allies had attached a lesser-known general to Fusag, the Germans might have been skeptical. But attach Patton, and suddenly the invisible army had a pulse. He gave mass to the lie. He gave intention to the lie. He gave it a commander whose appetite for attack felt so credible that German planners could almost hear the engines warming across the channel. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, men died in Normandy while Patton waited for release. The gap between his reputation and his actual location widened with every passing day. The world knew D-Day had begun, but the Germans still suspected the real hammer might not yet have fallen. This was one of the extraordinary achievements of Allied intelligence warfare. It is hard, in retrospect, to remember how uncertain things looked in June 1944. Today, Normandy appears inevitable, the obvious turning point in a war already moving against Germany. At the time, nothing felt inevitable. The beachhead could have been crushed, the port problem was severe, the German army in the west remained dangerous, and every reserve division that might have been thrown promptly into Normandy could increase the odds of a longer, bloodier, more fragile campaign. So when people ask why Patton was not allowed at D-Day, the answer is not that the Allies lacked faith in his aggressiveness, it is that they had too many reasons to hold him back. Political risk, coalition management, operational suitability, and strategic deception all pointed in the same direction. That convergence is rare in war. Usually decisions this large remain contested to the end. In Patton's case, the pressures aligned. Still, to leave the story there would reduce Patton to a passive piece on someone else's chessboard. He was never merely that. Even in imposed stillness, he exerted force. The legend of Patton had to be maintained, and he himself had helped create that legend over years of command and self-fashioning. His speeches, his toughness, his visible certainty under pressure, his insistence on offensive spirit, all had convinced the enemy he was exactly the sort of man to lead a massive cross-channel strike. In a paradox only war can produce, Patton's vanity and discipline, his brilliance and controversy, his theatricality and professionalism, all fused into a strategic mask that protected the real invasion. By July 1944, as the Normandy battle ground on, and Allied forces fought to break out of the constricting hedgerow country, the time approached to unleash him. The deception had largely done its work. The Germans had kept significant strength guarding against a second invasion longer than they should have. Hitler's fixation on the Pas-de-Calais threat endured disastrously. The beachhead survived. The machine could now shift from concealment to exploitation. Patton finally crossed to France after weeks of absence from the battle he had longed to join. Third Army would become operational on August 1, 1944, and once it was set loose after the breakout, Patton exploded across the map with the very ferocity his admirers expected. The speed of Third Army's advance through France seemed to confirm everything the Germans had feared about him. He pivoted, struck, turned, exploited, and pursued with an energy that felt almost violent even by the standards of a mechanized war. The ghost became flesh. The fake army commander became the real offensive weapon. In that sense, Patton's absence from D-Day was not the end of his story in the liberation of Europe, it was the price of the beginning. The Allies did not exclude him because they believed he had nothing left to offer. They excluded him because what he had to offer on June 6 was greater in illusion than in physical presence. And once the illusion had bought time, they intended to use the man himself. What remains emotionally powerful about the story is the personal contradiction at its heart. Patton believed, almost mystically, that he was born for war. He saw battle not as a regrettable necessity, but as the ultimate testing ground of civilization and manhood. He relished command in a way that made quieter generals uncomfortable. To such a man, being held back from history's most famous invasion would have felt like being locked outside destiny. He had to watch others carry the moment while he stood inside a lie made from his own name. And yet that lie helped save lives. Not in the sentimental way such claims are often made, but in the brutal arithmetic of military timing. If German reserves had been committed differently, if Calais had been mentally surrendered as a threat too soon, if the enemy had read the invasion picture more clearly in the first days, the battle for Normandy could have become even more catastrophic. Deception does not erase bloodshed, it redistributes it. It bends enemy strength into the wrong places. Patton's phantom command helped bend it. Eisenhower deserves attention here as well, because the decision to keep Patton out of D-Day required a kind of cold discipline few commanders relish. Eisenhower liked Patton personally more than some assumed and valued his abilities deeply. He also feared the chaos Patton could generate. Holding together the coalition meant making choices that would satisfy neither sentiment nor simple meritocracy. Eisenhower could not appoint commanders as though composing a list of the war's most colorful talents. He had to ask, who can I place where failure would be least likely? Who can I defend to Roosevelt, Churchill, Marshall, Congress, the press, and grieving publics if disaster comes? Who will British commanders work with? Who will not produce unpredictable headlines in the middle of a fragile invasion? Those questions cut against Patton, but Eisenhower also understood the strange opportunity hidden inside Patton's predicament. If Patton could not safely be placed in the opening command of Overlord, then perhaps his reputation could still shape Overlord's success from the shadows. That required both ruthlessness and trust. Ruthlessness, because it meant denying Patton the role he wanted most. Trust, because it meant believing he would play the part assigned to him despite his frustration. In the end, Patton did. There was no applause for that obedience in the moment. No beach photographs, no triumphant footage of him landing with the first waves, no instant public vindication. His contribution to D-Day existed in absence and misdirection, which are hard things for history to celebrate. We prefer visible heroism. We remember the men in the surf, the paratroopers in the night, the bunkers, the cliffs, the wreckage, the flags. We do not instinctively remember the general who stood back so the enemy would keep staring at the wrong stretch of coast. But Hitler remembered him, or rather, Hitler feared the idea of him. That fear is the key to the title's first half, the fake army Patton commanded that fooled Hitler. Hitler did not need to inspect every tank himself. He did not need to see every radio mast or depot. What mattered was that enough evidence existed to reinforce a picture he found persuasive. Patton, the Allies' most aggressive American commander, waiting in England opposite Calais with a striking force too large to ignore. That picture helped imprison German judgment, and when judgment is imprisoned at the top, armies bleed below. There is something almost theatrical in the image of Patton at this stage of the war, walking through camps and headquarters linked to a formation that was part performance, part weapon. Yet the theater was deadly serious. Deception on this scale was not a sideshow to the invasion. It was one of its shields. The Germans had to be made uncertain not only about where the Allies would land, but when the real decisive blow had actually begun. Fusag and Patton's role within it extended that uncertainty beyond June 6 itself. It was not enough to surprise the enemy once. The Allies had to preserve the wrong conclusion after the surprise, long enough for Normandy to harden into an irreversible fact. Patton's later battlefield exploits have, in some ways, overshadowed this phase because they are easier to dramatize in the conventional sense. The Third Army racing across France, the relief of Bastogne, the rapid turns and brutal drives, those are Patton's stories in the form people expect. But the weeks before and immediately after D-Day reveal something more complex and perhaps more revealing. They show Patton as a captive of his own reputation, a general so vividly feared that he became more useful as a threat than as a sword. They show the Allies turning personality into strategy. They show how modern war consumes even ego and scandal and recycles them into instruments. And the scandal mattered to the very end of this question. Had Patton emerged from Sicily untarnished, history might have looked different. Perhaps he would still have been too useful for deception. Perhaps he would still have been withheld to protect fortitude. But the moral and political stain of the slapping incidents made it much easier for Allied leaders to say no to him for the invasion command he craved. His own failures of self-control narrowed his path just as surely as enemy defenses did. He was not merely denied by circumstances outside himself. He helped create the circumstances that denied him. That is part of what gives the story its bite. It is not a simple tale of a great man misunderstood. Patton was not a victim of timid men afraid of genius, nor was he merely a reckless brute rightly punished. He was both magnificent and compromised, the kind of commander who forces history to deal in contradictions. The same intensity that made him terrifying to Hitler also made him dangerous to his own side. The same theatrical authority that inspired troops made him ideal for deception. The same scandal that nearly ended him made his exclusion from D-Day politically convenient. And the same hunger for battle that burned inside him gave extra credibility to the fiction that he was waiting to launch the real invasion. There is one last irony that deepens the story still further. On D-Day, thousands of ordinary soldiers were asked to suppress fear and obey orders in circumstances almost unimaginably violent. Patton, for once, had to do something strangely similar at a higher level. He had to suppress his own instinct to seize the center of action. He had to watch history happen without him physically in it. He had to obey a plan that demanded his non-appearance. For a man of his temperament, that may have been one of the hardest acts of discipline he ever performed. When he was finally released into France, he fought like a man making up for lost time. That furious energy has often been read simply as Patton being Patton, but one can also see in it the stored tension of a general who had spent the most crucial weeks of the war as an actor, inside a grand deception, denied the beaches, denied the opening, denied the immediate public redemption that combat might have given him. Once the gate opened, he surged through it. So why was George Patton not allowed at D-Day? Because by June 1944, he had become two men at once. One was the real Patton, gifted, aggressive, scandal-scarred, politically hazardous. too uncontrollable for the opening movement of the Allies' most delicate operation. The other was the imagined Patton in German minds, the hard-driving offensive commander, surely chosen to lead the decisive invasion through Calais. The first made Allied leaders cautious, the second made Allied deceivers greedy. Together they condemned him to command an army of ghosts while others stormed Normandy. And in one of the war's cruelest and most brilliant twists, that was exactly where he could do the most damage. While men died on Omaha and Utah and in the hedgerows beyond, Hitler kept looking over his shoulder for George Patton. He was looking in the wrong direction. And that mistake helped save the invasion.